Hey, this is Mark Miller and Gary Gruver for Extended Conversations with All Day DevOps. You know, when Gary gave his presentation during All Day DevOps in November, he had about 1,200 people register for the session. And we wanted to make sure that everybody had their questions answered. So I'm going to start off with a quick hello, Gary. How are you?
Good. How are you, Mark?
I'm doing good. We were just talking. You're in Idaho right now?
Yeah, Idaho is where I am when I'm not out helping people.
Yeah, it's got to be brutally cold. I know here in New York it's kind of sleet and rainy, but I'd prefer that to where you probably are right now with your temp.
Yeah, it was 5 this morning, 12 now, but I kind of like it that way, so it's good.
Yeah, we're here to talk about your new book. To remind people the name of the book,
Starting and Scaling DevOps and Enterprise.
right? And everybody that registered for this session and is attending the session does get a copy of your book, so that's kind of cool. Thank you for that. I want to start off with a question that somebody posted to us so that we can kind of get into the groove of answering questions right away. And this is coming from, let me get John's name so I've got it right here so I can get that right. John Walsh wrote in and he said, what are some of the best practices for involving enterprise change management and government groups into the deployment pipelines? So can you kind of start off with that? What's some best practices you're finding?
You know, a lot of what you're trying to do is get people to embrace working in a different way on an ongoing basis. And a key part of that is making them part of the journey, including them with you when you go down the process. And you know, I didn't see the benefits of it initially when the president of Macy's.com sort of kicked off a project with our auditing group during kind of their down season. They didn't have a lot to do, and he said, you know, we're thinking about changing how we do development delivery with CI/CD, and we want to bring the government. So we had them come in, and then we included them, and we started saying, you know, what are you trying to accomplish? What are your goals? And we started at that level. And then we said, and here's why we're trying to change things and how we're trying to change things, and we think there's some benefits. And we got them to help design what is the information that we would capture, where would we capture it, what did they need to accomplish it. And it really did a great thing because all of a sudden, instead of our plan, it became their plan, and they started taking ownership for its success. And what we said is, you know, what is the type of information that you need to capture? What do you need to know? And then when they came back to audit us at the end of the next year, they really came in with a list of, well, here's the data that we agreed that we wanted. Here's where it's going to be kept. And it became so easy for them to audit us that they became champions across the company for going more to infrastructure as code and automated tests. Because, you know, right now, if you're going to do auditing, you've got to figure out, did people do what they said they were going to do? And you've got to go to a manual change management tool, and then you got to figure out whether somebody manually implemented that change and then documented and wrote it down. And when you move to sort of a robust deployment pipeline, you've got all that captured in an SCM, and they had all the data. They knew exactly where to look for it, and they would come in and audit us in a matter of no time. And it wasn't just a matter of auditing 1 or 2 change tickets, because everything was automated. They knew everything was done that way. And it became so easy for them to do their job, they became huge champions. But if you would have gone in and told them that, no, we're changing it, and here's how we're changing it, here's how we're doing it, and didn't include them in the process, you probably would have gotten some resistance. So in a lot of cases, when I do these workshops or work with different people, it's how do you get the right people that need to embrace working differently to join you in the journey and go along the path to continuous improvement.
Good. That opens the door to how do you find that first core group of people to start your journey?
You know, it's interesting. I don't know how you do it when you come internally. You know, you can either do a grassroots thing. What I find a lot of times with the grassroots efforts is, you know, if you're in a small organization or you're in an organization with a loosely coupled architecture where teams can develop, qualify, and deploy code independently, those grassroots efforts seem to work fairly well, and they can make a lot of progress. But what I see in a lot of large companies is the architecture is tightly coupled, and if you're going to release more frequently, you need to get, you know, a large groups of different people to agree to working differently. And when you do that from a grassroots effort, I tend to see people get frustrated and give up after a while because they haven't convinced either their peers or their superiors that you need to make the change happen. And so that's a challenge I see in a lot of organizations. And so when I come in to do workshops, I try to get as high up into the executive staff as I can to help them understand their role of leading the transformation and getting the organization aligned. And I tend to start not by saying, let's do DevOps, or let's do Agile, or let's do Lean, or let's do Kanban. It's what about your software development process? Is it meeting your business needs now? And let's start with capturing that. And then I tend to map out the deployment years and decades. And when you try to increase different types of things, what you realize is you can't live with those inefficiencies. So you need to start knocking them off and fixing them one by one. And the broader view of the organization I can get to look at that systemic problem, the better success we have at getting people to really engage and follow through and commit to changing and making improvements to their system.
You know, the extension of John's question too, Gary, that is always of interest to me. He's asking for best practices in an industry that I don't think has best practices yet. And you and I were talking a little bit about that beforehand.
Yeah, one of the interesting things I see, and the reason this book that I just put out is really trying to map the deployment pipeline and find those inefficiencies, is there's a lot of practices that have been implemented across the industry, and people think, well, if I just go do this practice, then all of a sudden everything will work perfectly and everything will be nice. But as the reason I wrote this third book is because as I started really consulting with different companies on how to lead the transformation, how to get going, what I found is when I went into those companies, we were having a hard time figuring out where to start and what to improve. And even different deployment pipelines within the same company have different issues that need to be solved. So yeah, there are some best practices out there. There's some things that you can be doing, but if you're applying the best practice to the most efficient part of your deployment pipeline, it's not a very good use of your resources. What you really need to be doing is figuring out where the biggest inefficiencies are, because as you start this transformation, you're going to want people to start seeing some business benefits and start realizing some gains from it. And if you start where your biggest challenges are and your biggest inefficiencies are in your system, you'll get that. So I started with the mapping to try to figure that out. And what I find is, yes, there are some best practices, but make sure your best practices is solving something that is your biggest inefficiency. And it's not, too many people went off and did Agile and just did the rituals and lost track of the principles.
You know, it sounds almost like theory of constraints from the goal. The problem that I would see with that is if you're going to try to tackle a really large problem, it's hard to get people on the same page. How do you get people on the same page?
And that's what I tried to write down in this book, and that's what I do for workshops, is you get people together and you map your deployment pipeline. First, you break it down into the smallest, least complex deployment pipelines you can and get the people that personally own that piece of the business to be part of engaging how they're going to change it. And then you map it out and you get everybody to have a common view of the elephant. You know, the analogy in the book is it's like 5 blind men describing an elephant. And if they all go off and implement their ideas, you're going to have something that has all the right pieces and parts but doesn't really work like and look like an elephant and deliver the business results you need. So what I document in the book is kind of what I do for workshops. I get everybody in the same room, I document it, I put metrics to it, I get people to get a common understanding, and then coming out of that workshop or the meeting is, here's a list of the things that we can change in the next 30 days. It'll make the biggest difference. And what I see is what they identified during those first workshops is frequently just the first layer of the onion. And so when I do those, I continue to coach for the next 6 months. What did you discover? At the end of the month, what did you get done? What didn't you get done? What did you learn? And what are you going to do next? Because frequently they're just getting past the first layer of the onion to the next one, to the next one, and getting to the root cause of the problems. And it's not like these problems haven't existed in your organization for years and years. It's just as you try to drive up the frequency, you're finally going to have to deal with them, because in the past, your people have been just brute forcing their way through it. And with the automation, infrastructure as code, test automation, a lot of those things, you can finally solve those things once and for all if you can get the organization committed to investing in it and embracing working differently.
When I'm looking at something like this, my first inclination would be to find the easiest cherry pick to show that this can work. Are you finding that at all?
It's easiest cherry pick that has the biggest impact. So if it's a cherry pick that you can check a box and say we're doing DevOps, I would not. The easiest cherry pick that has an impact on your business results or the effectiveness of your organization, that's the one. And you want to get that momentum and gain that momentum to get people positively embracing this stuff and going forward.
And then the next thing that I know that the bean counters would want to know is, how are you measuring your progress? Do you have specific criteria?
You know, this is one of the ones I struggle with. And the first transformation I led at HP, we had number of products, we had our cost structure, and we had percentage of capacity of new features versus old. For a lot of websites and different things, it's really hard to measure the productivity. So when I talk about metrics with software development, what I coach executives to do is go out in the organization and get a qualitative feel for what's getting better and what's not getting better. Now that said, this third book is a lot about metrics. How do you measure and identify the biggest inefficiencies in your deployment pipeline? And what I didn't capture in the book, which I've started to really wrap my mind around as I've started working with more companies, is once you've identified with the metrics the thing that you're trying to go fix, what you should really be doing is you make a change, did it have the intended impact? And you should be reviewing that and learning that. So if you're finding 80% of your defects in your pre-prod environment and 5% next to development, and you move to more continuous integration with automated testing sooner, are you seeing the discovery of defects going much quicker so that the developers can improve and become more efficiently, or are you still waiting to find them out there at the end of the deployment pipeline? Or in a case of, well, I have a bunch of environment issues. If you implement and go after infrastructure as code or containers or something else like that, do those infrastructure issues go away and you're focused more on the code issues and fast feedback? So I tend not to think about go do DevOps. I tend to think about map out your deployment pipeline, put some metrics on it to find the biggest inefficiencies, and then start down a journey of continuous improvement and change something and measure to see if that had an impact on the metric that you're going to try to fix.
You know, Peter asked a question here along that same line, and I think he's opening up another way to look at this too, is when we're looking at cultural transformation, are you doing any measurements of that?
Well, cultural transformation in my mind is more around getting people to embrace these different ways of working, right? So if you're going to say, I'm going to do CI/CD or something like that, but you can't get the dev organization to keeping the builds green and responding to that, then you need to make those things happen. And for me, one of the things that I really think is important as I get engaged with companies is to start with the executives, because if I can come out of this workshop with it there being their plan, that they're taking ownership, and I'm helping coach them along the way in terms of developing and implementing their plan, they'll make those changes successful. But if it's a case where it's grassroots and there's 3 different teams that have to release code in unison because of tight coupling in the architecture, and 2 are signed up for the change, but the 3rd team just wants to continue breaking the builds and not worry about it, you're not going to fundamentally be able to improve. So being able to get that 3rd team to embrace working differently frequently involves a leadership over that, trying to get everybody aligned and agreed that they're going to work differently, and then holding them accountable for that. And if I can get the executives to own that plan, not necessarily develop it, because they don't know where the inefficiencies are and they need to work with their teams to do that. But once they've identified and prioritized those things, if they go after them as a team and they review these monthly checkpoints, and that's why, I do a monthly call-in with the people and I say, what did you get done? What didn't you get done? What did you learn? What are you going to do next? And that is, it's interesting. It gets the executives involved in a conversation that they probably have never had with their employees. They understand the things that are getting in their way. They're understanding inefficiencies. I was working with a company the other day, and they had a bunch of test automation, and they ran the test automation, and then they had to rerun the test automation because it was failing at a high rate, and then they reran it, and they finally got down to the list that wasn't working very well. And we got in the conversation. It's like, well, that the servers are undersized for the test automation to run on. And I had an executive saying, well, nobody told me that. I got a bunch of servers over here. Why don't we put them in place? And they put those in place, and all of a sudden, their test passing rate on their test automation went up by like 50%, and the rework and inefficiencies in it. But they hadn't had that conversation at that level to understand what was going on. And, the person with the test automation was getting frustrated because he felt like he'd been asking forever. But when you're able to get that in front of the executives and they understand the inefficiencies and what it's causing, it's amazing what they can do in terms of being able to find resources in terms of hardware or get people committed to working differently.
Nice, thanks. Rob just jumped in and he asks, we're trying to drive the DevOps transformation from the dev side of the business and get a huge amount of resistance from the executive teams on the ops side of the business. So what messaging would help us address our concerns over this kind of control? They feel that they're losing control. And I think you and I have heard that a lot before. A lot of people at the executive level don't want to lose control of what's going on.
I think part of this is, how large and tightly coupled system is it? So if you're thinking that DevOps is a developer pushes code into production and then they do whatever they want to and ops has to deal with it, that works well if you've got an architecture that enables small teams to take ownership for it. But if you've got an architecture that tightly couples work across 100, 150, 200 people, the likelihood that when you get called in for a SOC call that you know what's going on or know how to fix it's going to be low. And so it depends on what do you mean by DevOps, and you should really read the book if you haven't gotten a chance to, because I really highlight the types of things that you do in a loosely coupled organization versus a large, tightly coupled organization are different. And I think I tend to think that might be coming from a large, tightly coupled organization. And really, you don't go to dev just pushes into production. You go dev pushes into a deployment pipeline that works through the stages and gates into production, and you work on the inefficiencies there. So if that's the case, I try to get the ops people to read this third book, and Mark can help you guys get more e-copies of the book. As an author, you don't make money off the book, so I'm just trying to get it out there and try to help as many people as I can. But have the operations people read it, have them look at it, have them send me an email. We'll do a call and chat, and maybe get the dev leadership and the ops leadership on the same page, and just have a quick conversation to see, what are their concerns, what do they see are the issues, and how could that go? But I would think, my view of DevOps is based on living in large, tightly coupled organizations. So it may be a little different than what you're hearing in the industry as DevOps, and what they're hearing in the industry as DevOps may be driving some of their concerns.
Yeah. Let me jump in, Gary. Rob's trying to clarify here. He says, so they're very coupled. The dev teams are working to decouple hundreds of developers, multiple vendors, if that helps with what you're talking about.
Yeah, so if they're tightly coupled and your ops people are thinking DevOps means that dev just takes everything and pushes it in production, I think they've got a misconstrued view of how it's going to work. So if that's what you've got, then getting everybody aligned in a common view of the deployment pipeline would, I think, be an ideal first step. Getting the ops people and the devs people to read this book and get a common view, I think, would be a key step in the right direction. And then as you look at how do you set up a deployment pipeline, one of the things I talk about is building up that system and separating it out using service virtualization or some mocking. In a lot of cases, that's your first step towards your decoupling your architecture. Because if you can figure out how to independently develop and qualify different pieces, then you can figure out how to continually evolve them without breaking those interfaces. But the first step in my mind towards decoupling is figuring out where you want to decouple and reinforcing that interface with automated testing. And when you do that, it forces the consistency and the rigor there. And look through how do you break up the system, how do you segment the piece, and then how do you test and put that together. And then over time, I think you'll see that leading to more decoupling.
John follows with Rob too, trying to extend this question. He says, with all this going on, how do you talk to the auditing team, the idle champions? How do you get them on board of this deployment pipeline?
What we did in the beginning was we had an auditing. It was the auditing team had a slack period of the year, and we assigned them an auditing project, and they got asked to be in. And it's not that often your auditing teams get asked to come in and help define a process. They're usually the bad guys at the end, and you'd be amazed how receptive they are to an upfront engagement if you can catch them during the down period, and then help them understand what you're changing. Because right now what they're trying to do is validate that people did what you told them to do, and then they documented it. And Mark, you've raised teenagers before, right?
I'm in the middle of it, yes.
Yeah, better luck getting your computer to do what you tell it to do, or your teenager.
Well, at this stage, the computer.
Yeah. And that's a lot of what, when you do this infrastructure as code, test automation, what you're doing is automating all the stuff that auditing would be doing. And computers are much better at doing what you tell them to do. Even if you get it wrong once you fix it for all the change pieces, and helping them understand that and how easy it gets. Because right now, they're the babysitters in the organization trying to track a bunch of documentation. And once you move to a good deployment pipeline with infrastructure as code, everything's in SCM, and SCMs are designed for tracking change and documenting it, which is exactly what the auditing team has to go through and do. So if you help them understand how it's going to make their job that much easier, I think it wouldn't be that hard to get them on board and make them part of the process on the front end. Ask them, invite them in, get a project going when they have some downtime, and show how what you're doing is going to make the business successful, and what you're doing can make the business successful and their job easier. Who wouldn't want to be part of that?
Exactly. I've actually heard that numerous times. I mean, what does it take to invite somebody in and have a beer with me and talk it over, just to talk to somebody? I know Shannon Leitz, you know Shannon well, we've traveled together. She had one where somebody who was her biggest challenge in the company finally came in and said, okay, finally, show me what you're doing. And so when that happened, they were able to sit down. Now he's one of her greatest champions at the company at Intuit. It's a great story.
Yeah, at Macy's, when we were done, the audit team would go to central IT and go, I don't even know how to audit you anymore. You are so archaic and so backwards. I don't get it. But part of that was they were on the front end defining the process, and it was their process. And so when they realized how good and effective it was, and they went to other parts of the organization, they were just struggling to even do something that they've been doing for 15 or 20 years.
Great. Let's see, John, jump back in here with what are some of the ideas for handling when one team doesn't want to build bats for the deployment pipeline, especially if executives are fairly passive about the early stages? And again, I think executives are going to keep coming in here. How much does an executive play a role in this?
So, if teams can work independently, I think it's okay, and you don't need the executives that engaged. If the teams are tightly coupled, somebody needs to look across that system and own driving the improvement of the system and not the sub-optimization of the team. And so when they're tightly coupled, I think the executive is clearly responsible and accountable for pulling the team together and getting them to agree on what they're going to do. They may not know what the most important thing is, but getting people to come together and agree and committing to do it, and then following through, because you can invest a lot of time and energy automating everything, doing all the technologies, but if 9 of 10 of your teams change how they're going to work and the 10th doesn't, it's not going to work. At some point, it needs to be terms of employment. And because you can't change how you're going to work if somebody's continually breaking the build and not engaging in that.
It's funny you say that, the terms of employment. I've actually had to do that on one engagement before, where the lead executive just came in and said, if you want to work here, this is what you're going to do. Meaning, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's kind of, you'd like to see that as the last resort.
Right, yes.
It's and that's why with the workshops, what I try to do is get everybody to agree. These are the changes we're going to make, and then hold them accountable for following through and doing what they said. Because I frequently see the executive coming in and saying, thou must, without a good understanding of why they're doing it the way they're doing it, or what the problems are that they're currently dealing with.
Right. I think the argument, though, in this case is, if you've got 9 people agreeing that this is the way it's going to happen, and there's one person in the bottleneck.
Yeah, some point you've got to, and that's what I see the problem with the grassroots effort, is they don't have that level of influence to deal with that. And so you see people spending years getting 90% of the people there, and then not getting the business results that they wanted to because they can't change the last 10. And that's where I think it's important to engage the executives to get you can spend a lot of time and energy grassroots, but if I can make it the executive's plan and the executive's idea in my workshop, and that's what they walk out with, they'll own driving the changes to make it successful.
When you and I were in Stockholm, I think one of our conversations had to do with dinosaurs. And this is what this reminds me of, is if you have people that are not willing to change,
right?
How do you handle that?
You try to get them on board. You try to get them to embrace the change, and I think eventually it's terms of employment. One of my favorite presentations from DevOps Enterprise Summit, not this year but the year before, was Rosalind Radcliffe's on mainframes. And it wasn't that mainframes were bad or mainframes were evil. We just shouldn't be doing development on mainframes the same way we did it 30 years ago. And a lot of the people that started on mainframe 30 years ago are still doing it the same way. And it's the change management and getting them to think about embracing it differently. And look for champions, look for benefits, and you have to find a slice of capacity to enable people to learn and change and try and fail. And one of the harder things I have with organizations is really, they're already booked to 140% of the capacity. They do a workshop, they sign up for things, and then they don't have the bandwidth to follow through.
Yeah. We're talking a lot about negatives here. I think we could use a real war story about something positive. Give me something cool that you've seen happen.
Well, the transformation I led at HP was phenomenal. I learned so much from that organization and that group of engineers and leading that effort. And it had been the bottleneck for 2 decades. The HP couldn't add a product to our plans. We couldn't add new firmware capabilities without checking with the firmware.
Hold on a second. Let's back up a sec. Give me some subtext to that. So was this like in Eugene where they do the the printing, or what was what are you talking about at HP?
It was in Boise, Idaho. It was the embedded firmware for the LaserJet printers. And I had been in that business for quite a while and sat on the outside of the firmware organization and got frustrated by its inability to deliver. And I think in 80 or 90, 97, I got an opportunity to take over leading the group. And the group had been the bottleneck for 2 decades. Tried spinning the way out of the problem. HP had a lot of money to spend, and it tried spinning its way out of the problem and hired engineers around the world, and it was still the bottleneck. And I came in and got an opportunity to lead it. We were re-architecting it. I said, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And we went down a path of continuous improvement. 2008 hit. I had to cut my R&D spend in half from about $100 million to $65 million in 30 days and deliver a new architecture. And, we couldn't do things the same old way, so we had to try new things. And it was basically the same team had been doing this for 2 decades. But, with the process of going in and thinking about how to do things differently on an ongoing basis. And at the end of it, costs were about half. We're delivering 140% more products. And the number of our capacity that was going to new features went from 5% to 40%. So an 8 increase in innovation. And it fundamentally transformed that business. So the opportunities there are huge. And I think especially for large, tightly coupled systems, if you look at a lot of the DevOps stories, they're all about either small organizations or large organizations with loosely coupled architectures that enable people to move inefficient or move independently. But I think the biggest opportunities for improvement are in large, tightly coupled organizations. Not that they'll ever deliver code more frequently. It's just that DevOps is a lot about coordinating work across people. And the more people you have to coordinate the work across, the larger the inefficiencies. So systematically going after those inefficiencies, the productivity breakthroughs for the large organizations are going to be so much more dramatic.
That begs the question then, is what you use for large organizations, is it appropriate for small to medium organizations? Or are they 2 different things?
I think, and it's not necessarily organizations, it's how large is a team that independently can develop, qualify, and deploy code. If that's fairly small, you empower the team, you give them the tools, you give them the processes, you engage in the business, and you get out of the way. If that's large, you get to the problem that we were talking about earlier. You got to have 10 of the 10 teams committed to changing differently, not 9 of the 10 teams. And then you need more of an executive led, and you need more of a robust deployment pipeline that's automated and moving things through the system. So I do think it's very different for large, tightly coupled systems than it is for loosely coupled or small organizations.
All right. Where does that leave you going for the next year? What are you concentrating on for the next year?
Trying to help more companies. The 2 to 3x improvements that we got at HP are real and realistic for more and more organizations. And the more groups I work with, the more doing development like before we did it at HP than after. And I just think the business benefits are so huge in trying to help as many people as I can, whether it's through webinars, whether it's through the book, whether it's through workshops, whatever I can do, just because, I realize the benefits this can provide, and I can't think of anything more important for these large organizations to be doing, because, laser printers, we used to compete on print speed and print resolution and those things. And after a while, you don't need a 300 page per minute printer sitting on your desktop at 6,000 pixels per inch, right? It's not the value, and the values move to software. And that's happening in more and more companies around the world. And if these large traditional organizations can't figure out how to move fast and respond in the marketplace, and their competitors do, I think they're at huge risk. So I'm trying to help as many people as I can see the benefits and get started down this journey. I think you're on mute, Mark.
It helps when I have my microphone on, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a lot louder.
Another question that we have, and I like this one, is What are some of the quality gates that you've implemented in the past, and what groups would get involved with that?
So those can be anything from static code analysis that you can put on the front end at the different pieces. I think Sonatype has some good tools for that, for the open source and figuring out how you're letting stuff in. If you've got a small team, a lot of times it's about keeping the build green and how quickly can they respond to failures. But if you've got a large enterprise system, you can't have your build for the enterprise being broken on an ongoing basis. And you need to keep the code from getting in there. And one of the things you're trying to do in terms of improving productivity is developers want to do a good job. They thought they've done a good job. They've done their best effort in terms of security, compliance, performance, functionality. But unless you're giving them feedback, they don't know that they didn't do a good job. So our responsibility as an organization is to help them get better quality feedback quicker. And if you can do that as close to the developer as you possibly can, they get better and more efficient at it. So I tend to think about for each application, should have a quality gate before they get built into the larger system. And then if it's really large, you need to break that into subsystems with quality gates. And what you're trying to do is, what we talked about earlier is, I work with a lot of organizations that find 80% of their defects pre-prod. Well, if you're a developer and I come to you and go, Mark, 6 weeks ago when you checked this in, you broke everybody's other stuff. What were you thinking 6 weeks when you did that? Which your classic response is, 6 weeks ago? I don't know. I think Derek was in the code. Derek doesn't write very good code. I bet it was Derek's problem and not mine. Versus if I can tell you, this morning at noon, you and Derek checked in code and one of you broke this thing, do you think you're going to get better? Do you think you're going to improve? And whether that's your open source software came in with something that was obsolete, or whether that's something that came in and sort of said, you've got a performance issue or you have a security issue, people want to fix those things. But if you come to somebody as a security team, 2 days before the release and say, hey, there's this major security flaw that you wrote 2 months ago, can you fix it? People are moved on to other stuff and they're not going to be able to do it. But if you're giving them that feedback the day they're writing it or the day after they're writing it, they're going to learn and get better and your organization is going to get more productive.
That's something that doesn't get talked about enough, and that's immediate feedback. And that's part of this whole process.
Yeah, the other thing with the quality gates is you think about it, there's 3 types of inefficiencies or waste that I see in organizations. One is, developers working on stuff that won't work in production, won't be secure, that types of things. To fix that, you really need to increase the quality or frequency of feedback. The second is, people doing repetitive tasks manually. One of my favorite jokes by Jez Humble is, do you know what computers do when they find out that you're manually doing something that's easily automated? They sit up at night and drink beer and laugh at you. And then the other thing that you get with repetitive is if you automate those repetitive tasks, you get 2 benefits. One is they're much quicker. They're cheaper to do, so you can run them more frequently. And then the last is when you do them automatedly, you get the same answer every time. So you're not having to debug and triage manual errors in the system, which saves a lot. And then the last biggest inefficiency I see in a lot of organizations is just the triage time and effort. And a lot of large organizations spend more time triaging and debugging issues than they do writing the code in the first place. And so you solve that by going to smaller batch sizes. You solve that by quality gates much closer to specific applications to catch as much as you can. And then you monitor your deployment pipeline over time and see if you're doing a better job of taking your defect find rate from closer to pre-prod to closer to the developer and getting people to find and fix those things real time, because it does a couple of things. One is once you push it closer to the developer, it's a smaller group of people that's having to triage it. And 2 is if you're capturing it and gating it before it gets into an enterprise system, everybody's working on enterprise systems working on a much more stable system on an ongoing basis that's closer to release quality. So there's some key benefits to the quality gates, and those are automated tests in terms of a lot of people do unit, But eventually, as you're going more to a subsystem and a system, those are system tests. Those are static code analysis. Those are your sonotype scans. Those are your security scans. And hopefully it's performance testing in there somewhere, so where you're not waiting weeks to give somebody feedback that they messed up the performance of the system.
It's Peter asked a question here. Peter, I'm going to have to assume that you're a manager and you're thinking in this context. He says, what are the best ways to empower others to build a learning culture?
I really, one of the biggest things I do when I go into organizations that is I get them committed to what are they going to do for the next 30 days that's going to improve the process. And then I hold everybody getting them back together at the end of 30 days. What did you get done? What didn't you get done? What did you learn? And what are you going to do next? And I think you'll find if you get the team to go through and map it and agree on the biggest inefficiencies, and then get them to go down the journey together. At HP, the transformation that we led there wasn't based on, gee, let's go off and figure out a 3-year plan or a 4-year plan or something. It was every month we got together and we reviewed a checkpoint. We had people come in and do demos, and we did all that. And people went down the path as a journey. And it wasn't until we got 3 years down the line that we looked back and saw how radically we transformed everything. As part of the learning organization, as a manager and executive, get people committed to checkpoints. And it's not just on the business deliverables, it's on the sharpening the saw side. So many organizations get so busy cutting that they're cutting with a pretty dull blade. And you need to get people committed to a certain percentage of capacity sharpening the saw. And then hold those checkpoints. Have everybody get together and talk about it once a month. And what you get done, what didn't get done. And you'll find that there may be things that you're doing as a manager that's driving the saw never to get sharpened.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I think one of the things that people don't realize when they hear the buzzword DevOps, and somebody in the chat room actually said they actually stopped using the word DevOps because there's so much connotation to it now. Just do what you're supposed to do. What happens when the champion leaves? We've seen that happen before, where there's one person driving, whether it's an executive or whoever, and that person leaves.
Yeah, that's hard. As I left HP, Mike Young kept things moving and going. As I left Macy's, I think it tended to falter. Right, there wasn't the follow-through and engagement. And actually, just posted this morning, they ended up with rough times and everything else, shutting down the team the remote team I developed in Boise to drive a lot of this. So sometimes it's hard. You can look for a new champion. And like I say, the more people you have fingerprints on it going in, the less it's dependent on one person. So hopefully you try to take as many people on the journey with you as you can, and you're not as susceptible to one person leaving. And then, eventually you get down to, what was my favorite quote from Martin Fowler? At some point, you either need to be able to change the culture or change cultures. And so if you can change and drive it, great, and you can get there. If not, there are so many places and so many companies that are trying to move and improve in this direction. I think there's a large numbers of opportunities out there for people that are willing to drive the change and make them happen.
Good. So Gary, what's the final message you want to leave with people? What would you like everybody to walk away with?
Get started. Start your improvement process and start to hold your monthly checkpoints and reviewing it. And, take the time to read the book, get it out there. Get your peers to read the book so you're having a common terminology, because the more people you can take with you and get along going on the common journey, and the more you can get them going there, you'll make mistakes, you'll stumble along the way, but if you go together as a team, you'll make breakthroughs that you can't imagine possible. And if I'm right and what's out there for you is a 2 to 3x improvement in productivity like we had at HP, I can't imagine anything more important for you and your company to become.
Great. Thank you, Gary. Very good to talk to you again. I hope to see you. You and I see each other on the speaking circuit quite a bit. So I'm
Occasionally.
running. Where are you going to be speaking next?
You know, I don't have an event on the schedule just yet. I'm doing more workshops this year, but we'll see what comes up.
Okay, great. So for those of you that are listening, Gary has the consulting business that can come in and help you set up these transformational processes. And he can help you analyze what's going on in the company and see how you can make those types of improvements. Gary, good to talk to you. Thank you.
Yeah, great to talk to you, Mark. Best of luck for everybody. And, you know, if you can't pull me in, at least get everybody to read the book and see if you guys can't do your stuff on your own.